Slavery in Islam is a topic rarely explored in depth, yet it's often referenced by many in the West to critique Muslim civilization for permitting it. But the reality of slavery in Islam, its meaning, and its context are far more nuanced than these criticisms suggest. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the concept of slavery in Islam and explore what it truly meant in Islamic culture. Understanding the context of slavery in Islam. First, we need to grasp the historical context. Slavery in the Muslim world was fundamentally different from the practices of Western countries. Islam was the first religion to formally establish rights for slaves, an unprecedented move in its time. The very concept of a slave in Islam diverged greatly from Western norms, where slaves were often treated as subhuman, used merely for labor and breeding, and subjected to brutal mistreatment, including beatings and even death at the hands of their owners. In contrast, Islamic teachings imposed strict guidelines on how slaves were to be treated. For example, the Prophet Muhammad instructed, "You must feed them with the same food you eat and clothe them as you would clothe yourself. You cannot overburden them with work, and if you do, you must help them with the load." This demonstrates the drastically different approach to slavery in Islam. In Western contexts, slaves were often dehumanized, while in Islam, they were given rights and treated with dignity. For further reading, you can refer to the article, Islam QA, linked in the description, which provides more detailed references on the rights of slaves in Islam. Why didn't Islam abolish slavery completely? A question often asked is, why didn't Islam abolish slavery outright? To answer this, we need to understand the historical backdrop. In Islam, the only legitimate way to acquire slaves was through war. Captured enemies could be taken as slaves. Beyond that, there was no other form of enslavement permitted. 1,400 years ago, there were no formal incarceration systems or jails in Arab lands. Taking captured enemies as slaves served as a practical solution, akin to imprisonment. Over time, many of these enslaved individuals were set free, a practice heavily encouraged in Islamic teachings. In fact, the Prophet emphasized freeing slaves as a virtuous act. Abu Hurairah narrated that the Prophet said, "Whoever frees a Muslim slave, Allah will free all the parts of his body from the hellfire as he freed the body parts of the slave." If one failed to keep a promise made to God, freeing a slave was often a required form of repentance. This clearly illustrates Islam's long-term intention to free slaves and its emphasis on humane treatment. But why not ban slavery entirely? You might still wonder, wouldn't it have been easier to ban slavery altogether? The truth is, slavery was a key pillar of economic and social structures during medieval times. Civilization as we know it today was built, in part, on systems of forced labor. Every major civilization, be it in the West or East, prospered through slavery. In the West, slavery was only abolished after the Industrial Revolution, when human labor could be replaced with machinery. Employees working set hours became more practical and efficient than maintaining slaves. Thus, in earlier centuries, completely banning slavery wasn't a feasible option. Instead, Islam took steps to humanize the practice, controlling it and stripping away its most inhumane aspects. The consequences of abolishing slavery suddenly. So, what would have happened if slavery had been abolished suddenly? History provides us with answers. In the U.S. following the abolition of slavery, segregation followed. Former slaves were treated as second-class citizens, denied basic human rights. Decades of racial tension, conflicts, and inequality followed. Even today, the legacy of that abrupt abolition lingers in the form of ongoing racial divisions and discrimination. Islam's approach was different. By encouraging empathy, feeding, clothing, and working alongside slaves, Muslims were more likely to treat them with dignity. This is reflected in the rise of former slaves to prominent positions in Muslim society. Many became scholars, leaders, and even rulers. A perfect example of this is the Mamluks, who were originally slaves but later became rulers. The Moors, who had slave origins, ruled parts of Europe. In Islam, slaves were not just liberated, they were empowered, which contrasts sharply with Western practices that often kept former slaves oppressed. When we compare these histories, the contrast is striking. Islamic culture uplifted slaves, giving them rights and opportunities that Western civilization, at the time, did not. The long-term effects of these differing approaches are still visible today.